February 1965. Hubert Humphrey had just made the biggest mistake of his political life. He'd been vice president for exactly 21 days. What Lyndon Johnson told him in the Oval Office that afternoon would break him in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his career. But to understand why this moment destroyed Humphrey, you need to know what he'd just done. That morning, Humphrey had sent Johnson a memo. Not just any memo, but a document arguing against the escalation of the Vietnam War. He laid out, point by point, why bombing North Vietnam would be a catastrophic mistake. He cited intelligence reports, diplomatic channels, potential casualties. He even suggested that Johnson was risking the same fate as the French in Indochina. Humphrey thought he was doing his job. He was the vice president. He was supposed to give counsel. He'd been a senator for 16 years, one of the most respected liberal voices in America. He'd fought for civil rights when it was political suicide to do so. He'd championed Medicare. Lyndon Johnson had chosen him precisely because of his integrity and intelligence. He had no idea what was about to happen. According to multiple accounts from those present, when Humphrey walked into the Oval Office, Johnson was waiting with several advisors: Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense; McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor; Dean Rusk, Secretary of State. The memo was on Johnson's desk. The atmosphere was tense. What happened next has been reconstructed from later testimony by participants and Humphrey's own recollections. Johnson's response was devastating. He made clear that Humphrey had crossed a line. The memo questioning Vietnam policy was viewed as disloyalty, as weakness, as a fundamental misunderstanding of his role. Johnson reportedly told Humphrey in explicit terms that he had shown poor judgment, that he had demonstrated he didn't understand what being vice president meant, that he wasn't in the Senate anymore, where debate was encouraged. He was in the executive branch now, and that meant supporting the president's decisions. The criticism escalated. According to accounts, Johnson questioned Humphrey's courage and fitness for the office. He pointed out that American troops were already in Vietnam and suggested that Humphrey's position would amount to abandoning them. He made it clear that this kind of dissent would not be tolerated. Witnesses later reported that Johnson was furious. His voice rose. The meeting became increasingly one-sided, with Humphrey barely able to respond. McNamara and the others remained silent, watching as Johnson systematically dismantled Humphrey's arguments and his dignity. Then came what Humphrey later described as the most painful part. Johnson reportedly made it clear why he had selected Humphrey as vice president. It wasn't primarily because of respect or admiration. Robert Kennedy had wanted the position. Kennedy had support among delegates. But Johnson needed someone who wouldn't threaten him, who wouldn't use the vice presidency as a platform to build an independent power base. Humphrey had been chosen in part because he was seen as controllable. The message was unmistakable. Humphrey's future, his dreams of the presidency, depended entirely on Johnson's goodwill, and that goodwill required absolute loyalty on Vietnam. According to later accounts, Johnson made his expectations crystal clear. Humphrey was to support administration policy on Vietnam without question. He was to make no more private objections. When he spoke publicly, he would defend every decision the president made. There would be no more memos arguing against the war. The humiliation went further. In the weeks and months that followed, Humphrey found himself excluded from key National Security Council meetings on Vietnam. He received briefings, but he was no longer part of the inner circle making decisions. His role became ceremonial. He would represent the administration, he would give speeches, but he would not shape policy. What happened when Humphrey left that meeting has been documented by his staff and later confirmed by Humphrey himself. He returned to his office visibly shaken. His assistant and others who saw him reported that his face was flushed, his composure shattered. According to these accounts, Humphrey went into his private office, closed the door, and broke down. Staff members reported hearing him crying, deep emotional sobs that were shocking from a man known as the happy warrior, always optimistic, always smiling. This was Hubert Humphrey, one of the most powerful politicians in America, weeping in his office because of what the president had just done to him. Humphrey did write another memo to Johnson shortly afterward. In it, he backed away from his earlier position. He expressed support for the president's judgment. He pledged his loyalty. It was a complete reversal from the memo that had triggered the confrontation. From that point forward, Hubert Humphrey became a different political figure. For the next 3 years, he served as one of the administration's most vocal defenders of the Vietnam War. He gave speeches supporting the bombing campaigns. He argued that progress was being made. He defended policies he had privately opposed just weeks earlier. His former allies in the liberal movement were stunned. Senators and activists who had worked with Humphrey for years watched him champion a war they knew he had serious doubts about. Some begged him to speak out, but Humphrey remained loyal to Johnson, even as the war became increasingly unpopular. The consequences came in 1968. Johnson, destroyed by Vietnam, announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Humphrey won the Democratic nomination for president. This was the prize Johnson had implicitly offered back in 1965. Support me, and someday this could be yours. But the Democratic Convention in Chicago descended into chaos. Anti-war protesters clashed with police in the streets. The images were broadcast around the world. And inside the convention hall, Hubert Humphrey couldn't bring himself to break with Johnson on Vietnam. His advisors pleaded with him. The polls showed he was losing because of the war. But the memory of that February meeting 3 years earlier still controlled him. He finally suggested a modified position on bombing in late September, just weeks before the election. By then, it was too late. Richard Nixon won the presidency by approximately 500,000 votes out of 73 million cast. Humphrey lost one of the closest elections in American history, in large part because he couldn't distance himself from a war he'd never fully believed in.
After leaving office, Humphrey spoke more openly about his vice presidency, though always carefully. In interviews and with friends, he described it as the most difficult period of his political life. He acknowledged feeling constrained, unable to express his real views, trapped between his principles and his ambition. Associates reported that even years later, discussions of his time as vice president would visibly affect him. The normally ebullient Humphrey would become quiet, sometimes emotional. He told confidants that the experience had changed him, that something had been lost that he could never quite recover. Johnson did keep Humphrey's original February 1965 memo. After Johnson's death, it was found among his private papers. Researchers noted that Johnson had written marginal comments on it, dismissing Humphrey's arguments. The memo stood as evidence that Humphrey had been right about the war's trajectory and that Johnson had silenced him anyway. In 1976, Humphrey returned to the Senate, winning election in Minnesota. Back in the legislative branch, he regained some of his old fire. He fought for progressive causes. He spoke more freely. But colleagues noticed a change. There was a wariness that hadn't been there before, a hesitation when discussing executive power and presidential authority. In private conversations later in his life, according to those who knew him well, Humphrey acknowledged that the February 1965 confrontation had been a turning point. He had believed he could maintain his principles while serving as vice president. He had believed integrity and loyalty could coexist. The meeting with Johnson had taught him otherwise. One senator later recounted Humphrey saying that Johnson had forced him to choose between his conscience and his ambition, and that he had chosen ambition. The cost of that choice, Humphrey reportedly said, was a piece of his soul that he never got back.
Years later, during the 1968 campaign, Johnson reportedly dismissed Humphrey to reporters with a cruel shorthand. When asked what he thought of his vice president's candidacy, Johnson said Humphrey cried too much. Pressed to explain, Johnson repeated the phrase and refused to elaborate. To Johnson, emotional restraint wasn't a flaw, it was a requirement. And in his private calculus of power, Humphrey's vulnerability was disqualifying. The tragedy was compounded by history's verdict. Humphrey's memo had been prescient. The escalation in Vietnam did prove disastrous. The bombing campaigns failed to break North Vietnamese resolve. American casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Public support collapsed. The war consumed Johnson's presidency and crippled Humphrey's. If Johnson had considered Humphrey's arguments in February 1965 instead of crushing them, the outcome might have been different. But Johnson's fear of appearing weak, of being the first president to lose a war, drove him to reject any dissent. And Humphrey, who entered that office believing he could influence policy, left knowing he couldn't. The tears Humphrey cried that day, according to those who knew about them, weren't just about Johnson's anger. They were about the realization of his own powerlessness. They were about understanding that he would compromise everything he believed in for a chance at the presidency. They were about knowing that Johnson saw this weakness in him, and that they both would live with that knowledge. What Lyndon Johnson told Hubert Humphrey in that meeting destroyed more than just their relationship. It destroyed Humphrey's faith that speaking truth to power was possible in the modern presidency. It destroyed his belief that he could be both loyal and honest. It destroyed the optimistic senator from Minnesota who thought he could change things from the inside. Humphrey served out his vice presidency, won his party's nomination, lost the general election, and returned to the Senate. He accomplished important things in his later years, but those who knew him best said he never fully recovered from what happened in February 1965. The happy warrior had learned that in Lyndon Johnson's White House, happiness and integrity were luxuries a vice president couldn't afford.
That was what Johnson told Humphrey that made him cry. Not just words of anger or threats of political consequences, but a fundamental lesson about power in America. That proximity to it means nothing without the will to resist it. That ambition can become a prison. That sometimes the price of a career is the very principles that made that career meaningful in the first place. And Hubert Humphrey paid that price, in that office, on that February day, with tears that marked the end of one kind of political life and the beginning of another he had never wanted to live.
This video is based on historical accounts from memoirs, scholarly biographies, archival documents, oral histories, and testimonial evidence from individuals present during the events described. While the narrative follows documented historical events, specific dialogue and private moments have been reconstructed from available sources. Historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources for further research on these events. This content is intended for educational purposes.